They say 300 Apache warriors once guarded a dying cowboy, and not a single man dared step past their horses. The wind moved first that morning, low and steady across the dry grass, carrying the smell of dust and old wood through a valley that had forgotten most men who passed through it, but not this one. Ethan Cole lay on the narrow bed inside a weather-beaten ranch house that leaned just slightly to the west, like it had grown tired of standing straight, his boots still on, his hat resting on the post beside him as if he might reach for it any second and ride out like he used to. But he hadn't ridden in weeks, not since the coughing started taking more from him than sleep ever gave back. Outside, the sound of horses didn't come like a storm or a charge, no thunder, no urgency, just a slow, deliberate presence, the kind that settled into the land as if it had always belonged there. One horse became 5, 5 became 20, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge, there were more than any man in that county could count without losing track, lined across the open stretch of dirt and scrub like a quiet line drawn between what was and what would be remembered. The townsfolk had gathered at a distance, 50 yards out at least, some standing beside wagons, others half hidden behind fence posts, all of them watching the same thing with the same question pressing behind their eyes. Why weren't they moving? No one shouted. No one reached for a rifle, not even the sheriff, who stood with his hand resting awkwardly near his belt as if unsure whether it belonged there anymore. Because the warriors weren't there for a fight. They sat tall in their saddles, still as carved stone, their horses calm beneath them, breath rising in soft clouds that drifted and disappeared before touching the ground. At the center of it all stood one rider who had dismounted without a sound, her boots pressing into the dust as if she carried no weight at all, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes fixed on the ranch house with a kind of patience that didn't belong to anger or mercy, but something older, something quieter. Inside, Ethan shifted just enough to feel the ache in his chest tighten again, a slow reminder that time had already made its decision about him. He didn't need to look out the window to know they were there. He had heard the first hoofbeat before dawn, had counted them in his head the way a man counts breaths when he knows they matter, and somewhere between the 10th and the 100th, he had stopped counting altogether. There was no surprise left in him, only recognition, the kind that settles deep and doesn't ask permission. His hand moved, slow and unsteady, toward the small wooden table beside the bed, fingers brushing against a thin leather cord that lay coiled like it had been waiting, and when he picked it up, the small pendant at the end caught a strip of morning light and held it there for a second longer than it should have. He stared at it the way a man looks at something that has outlived its purpose but not its meaning, and for a moment, the room felt less empty, less final. Outside, one of the younger men in town whispered something under his breath about vengeance, about old stories coming back to settle themselves. But the older ones said nothing, because they had seen enough years to know that not every gathering of warriors meant blood, and not every silence meant peace. The woman at the center took one step forward, then stopped, her gaze never leaving the door, as if she could see through wood and shadow and time itself. And maybe she could, because there are some promises that don't fade, no matter how far they travel or how long they wait. Ethan let out a breath that sounded more like memory than air, his grip tightening slightly around the pendant before easing again, and in that small motion lived 15 years of dust roads, empty nights, and a single sentence he had carried longer than any gun he'd ever worn. He closed his eyes, not to rest, but to remember, and somewhere beneath the weight of years and distance, a younger man stood in a river with water rushing past his knees, holding on to someone who looked at him with fear and something else he hadn't understood back then, and he heard his own voice again, clearer than anything in the room around him now. "I'll come back for you." The words had been simple, almost careless, the kind of man says when the moment feels bigger than consequence. But out here, words didn't disappear into the air. They settled into the ground, into the bones of things, waiting for the day they would be called back. Outside, the line of warriors didn't move, the horses didn't shift, and the wind, for the first time that morning, went still, as if the land itself had decided it was time to listen. The first time Ethan Cole saw her, the river was louder than any thought a man could hold on to, swollen from mountain snow and moving fast enough to pull branches, stones, and anything careless enough to step too close into its cold grip. And he had not been looking for trouble that day. Only a stray calf that had wandered too far from the herd. But trouble had a way of finding men who rode alone. He heard her before he saw her. Not a scream. Not exactly. More like a sharp breath carried across water. The kind that made a horse lift its head and a man tighten his grip without knowing why. And when he turned, he saw her caught near the bend where the current twisted hardest, her dark hair soaked and clinging to her face, her hands fighting against something stronger than strength could answer. He did not think about it. Not then, not later. He just moved, sliding from the saddle and stepping into the river with boots that filled instantly, the cold rising up his legs like a warning he chose to ignore, and the current pushed back the moment it felt him there, as if the river itself did not want to give her up. She saw him when he reached her, her eyes wide, not with relief, not yet, but with a kind of fear that did not belong to the water alone, and for a second, just a second, he hesitated, not because he would turn back, but because he realized he did not understand what he was stepping into. Then the moment passed, and he took hold of her arm, steady but firm, pulling her toward the shallower edge where the rocks broke the current just enough to give them both a chance. When they reached the bank, she pulled away from him almost immediately, stumbling back a few steps, her breathing uneven, her hands gripping the torn edge of her dress, as if holding it together meant holding something else in place. Ethan raised his hands slightly, palms open, not a gesture he had practiced, just something that felt right in a moment that had no clear path forward. "I was trying to help," he said, his voice quieter than the river now, and she watched him as if measuring something he could not see, her eyes moving over his face, his clothes, the way he stood without reaching for anything that could harm her. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet earth and sage between them, and for a moment, neither moved. Then she spoke, her English careful, shaped by effort, but clear enough to land where it needed to. "You should not have touched me." The words were not angry, not accusing, just heavy with something he did not yet understand, and he nodded once, slow, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because out here, understanding often came after the fact, if it came at all. "I did not have much choice," he said, glancing back at the river that had already begun to forget them, its surface smoothing as if nothing had happened. And when he looked back at her, something had changed, not in her posture, but in the way she held his gaze a second longer than before. Footsteps echoed faintly from the ridge above, not loud, not rushed, but enough to make her turn sharply, her expression tightening in a way that told him more than words could have. She stepped closer to him then, close enough that he could see the small scar near her wrist, the way her fingers trembled just slightly before stilling again. "They will not understand," she said, her voice lower now, almost lost to the wind, and he followed her gaze up the slope where shapes began to appear against the sky, still and watchful, like shadows that had decided to take form. Ethan felt the weight of that moment settle into his chest, not fear, not exactly, but the recognition that whatever line he had crossed stepping into that river was not one he could step back over just as easily. He looked at her, really looked this time, past the water and the torn fabric and the distance between them, and saw something steadier beneath it all, something that had not broken even when the current tried to take her under. "I am not here to cause trouble," he said, though the words sounded smaller than the moment they were spoken into, and she almost smiled, not because she found it funny, but because she knew something he did not. "Trouble does not ask where you are," she replied, her eyes flicking once more to the ridge where the figures had grown clearer, more defined, and then back to him. "It finds you." The silence that followed stretched just long enough to matter, and in that space, Ethan made a decision that did not feel like one, because it did not come from thought, but from something quieter, something that had guided him long before he knew how to name it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin leather cord, worn from years of use, the small pendant at its center catching a dull glint of light as he held it out. Not as an offering, not exactly, but as something shared between two moments that had not yet found their meaning. "Take this," he said, his voice steady now, and she looked at it, then at him, her expression unreadable for a second before she reached out and took it, her fingers brushing his just long enough to register, and then gone again. "Why?" she asked, and he shook his head once, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer would not fit into words that would make sense here, now, with the ridge behind her and the river at his back. So he gave her something else, something simpler, something that would follow them both whether they wanted it to or not. "I will come back for you," he said, the sentence settling into the air between them as if it had weight. And this time, when she looked at him, the fear was still there, but it was not alone anymore. It was standing beside something quieter, something that did not believe him, but did not dismiss him either. Then she turned, moving toward the slope where the others waited, and for a moment, just before she reached them, she paused, her hand closing once around the pendant at her neck as if testing whether it was real, and then she was gone, swallowed by the ridge and the distance, and the kind of silence that does not end, it just changes shape. Ethan stood there a second longer than he needed to, the river moving on without him, the sky stretching wide above as if nothing had shifted, but something had, something small and easy to overlook, the kind of thing that waits, quiet and patient, until the day it becomes something no one can ignore. He did go back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that too, riding the same stretch of land until his horse began to recognize the turns before he made them, until the river no longer sounded like a warning, but like something waiting for an answer that had not come yet. The tracks on the bank were gone by morning, washed clean by a current that did not keep memories, and the ridge where she had disappeared stood quiet under a pale sky, giving him nothing in return for the hours he spent watching it. Ethan did not call out, not once, because something in him understood that whatever world she belonged to did not answer to a stranger's voice, no matter how steady or well-meaning it might be. Instead, he looked for signs, small ones, the kind a man learns to notice when he spends enough time alone, a bent blade of grass, a stone turned over where it had no reason to be, the faint imprint of a hoof that did not belong to his own horse. But each sign led nowhere, dissolving into the same silence that had taken her. By the fourth day, the sun had grown sharper, pressing heat into the back of his neck as he rode, and the weight of what he had said began to settle in a way it had not before, not heavy, not crushing, just present, like something that had chosen to stay whether he wanted it to or not. "I will come back for you." The words returned to him without effort, carried on the rhythm of his horse's stride, and he realized then that a promise did not need to be heard to exist. It only needed to be spoken once to start shaping the road ahead. On the fifth morning, he brought something with him, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, bread, dried meat, a tin cup, nothing special, nothing grand, just enough to say that he had not forgotten the moment or the person tied to it. And he set it near the river where he had first seen her, not hidden, not displayed, just placed where it could be found if someone chose to look. He did not wait to see if it would be taken. He turned his horse and rode back, because waiting had begun to feel like a kind of intrusion, and whatever line he had crossed before, he did not intend to cross another without understanding the cost. Days turned into weeks, and the land shifted the way it always did, slow and indifferent, grass growing where it could, dust settling where it must, and the river returning to a calmer flow that made it easy to forget how fierce it had been. Ethan worked his cattle, mended fences, rode the outer edges of his property the way a man does when he has nothing else to anchor him. But each time he passed within a mile of that bend in the river, his eyes drifted without asking permission, searching for something that had no reason to still be there. Once, he thought he saw a movement on the ridge, a figure standing just long enough to be noticed and then gone. But he did not follow. Not that time. Because something told him that chasing it would turn it into something else entirely, something less honest than what it had been. Another time, he found the cloth bundle gone, no trace left behind, no sign of who had taken it or when, and he stood there longer than he meant to, looking at the empty space as if it might offer an explanation if he gave it enough time. He did not smile, but something in his chest loosened just enough to be felt. Then came the morning he did not ride out at all. The sky had turned a dull gray before dawn, the kind that promised rain but did not commit to it, and his horse shifted restlessly in the small corral, as if sensing something that had not yet reached the ground. Ethan stepped onto the porch, boots worn from miles that no longer needed counting, and he looked out across the open land with the same steady gaze he had carried for years, but there was something different in it now, something quieter, less certain. He stayed there longer than usual, listening, not for hoofbeats or voices, but for something harder to name, something that felt like it had been moving toward him from a distance he could not measure. When the rain finally came, it did not fall hard, just a steady line of drops that darkened the dirt and softened the edges of everything it touched, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan did not ride that day, and he did not go to the river the next, or the next after that, not because he had forgotten, but because something in him understood that not all returns happened on a schedule a man could follow. The promise remained where it had always been, not in the air, not in the land, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that did not measure time the way days and weeks did. And though he did not say it again, not out loud, not to anyone who might hear, it stayed with him in the quiet moments between one breath and the next, unchanged, untested, waiting for a day that had not yet decided to arrive. The rain did not last, but it changed something all the same, not in the land, which returned to dust soon enough, but in the way Ethan moved through his days, slower now, not from age alone, but from a quiet understanding that some roads no longer led where they once promised. Weeks stretched into months, and the river bend became a place he passed without stopping, not out of forgetting, but out of a kind of respect for what had not chosen to return. The seasons shifted the way they always did out there, subtle at first, then undeniable, the heat giving way to a cooler wind that carried the scent of dry leaves and distant fires, the sky stretching wider, as if making room for something unseen. Ethan kept working, because work was the one thing that did not ask questions, mending broken rails, checking water lines, riding out at first light, and returning when the shadows grew long enough to touch the porch steps. The pendant was no longer with him, and sometimes, when his hand drifted to his pocket without thinking, he would pause, not in regret, but in recognition of something that had been given away without knowing what it would cost. He did not speak of it to anyone, not to the trader who passed through every few weeks with news from towns that felt farther away each time he heard about them, not to the old man who lived 2 miles east and had a habit of talking more than listening. It was not a story meant for telling, not yet, maybe not ever. Then one afternoon, near the end of a long stretch of dry days, he noticed something that did not belong, a horse track near the edge of his land, faint but deliberate, heading in from the north where no regular trail ran. It was not fresh, but it was not old either, and it held a steadiness that suggested purpose rather than wandering. Ethan followed it for a while, not in pursuit, just in observation, letting it lead him across a low rise where the wind had not yet erased it, until it faded into ground too hard to mark. He stood there for a moment, looking out across the open stretch beyond, and for the first time in a long while, something in his chest shifted, not hope, not exactly, but a quiet awareness that the past had not settled as completely as it had seemed. He did not follow further. Instead, he turned back, because whatever had left that track was not asking to be chased, and he had learned enough by then to listen to what was not being said. Days later, he found something else, not near the river, not on the ridge, but closer to home, resting on the top rail of his front fence as if it had been placed there with care. It was a small piece of leather, worn and familiar in a way that made him stop before he reached for it, his breath catching just slightly as recognition settled in before his fingers did. He picked it up slowly, turning it over in his hand, and there it was, the same stitching, the same mark near the edge where it had once been pulled too tight, the same quiet weight that did not belong to the object itself, but to what it carried. The cord was there, but the pendant was not. For a moment, he said nothing, did nothing, just stood there with the fence at his side and the open land stretching out in front of him, the wind moving past like it always did, unchanged by what had just shifted. Then he looked up, not toward the river this time, but toward the horizon where the land met the sky in a thin, unwavering line, and he understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before. She had been here, not passing through, not by accident, but here, close enough to see, close enough to leave something behind and take something with her. The promise did not return all at once, not like a storm or a sudden memory, but like a slow unfolding, piece by piece, until it stood in front of him again, not as words, but as something that had moved on without him. That night, he did not sleep much. The ranch creaked the way old wood does when the temperature drops, the quiet filled with small sounds that most men learn to ignore, But Ethan listened to all of it, as if somewhere between those sounds there might be an answer waiting to be heard. Before dawn, he stepped outside, the air cool and still, the kind that settles low before the sun rises enough to break it apart. And he stood there for a long time, looking out over land that no longer felt entirely his, not because it had been taken, but because something had been returned to it that he did not fully understand. He thought about riding out, about following the direction of that faint track, about stepping once more into something he had already touched and lost, but he did not move. Instead, he stayed where he was, his hand closing once around the empty leather cord before releasing it again. And in that small motion, there was no regret, no urgency, just a quiet acceptance of a truth that had been forming for years without him noticing. Some promises are not broken when a man fails to return. Some are simply carried by someone else, across distances he may never see, until the day they come back in a form he no longer recognizes. Years did not pass all at once. They settled slowly, like dust on a fence rail, so light you did not notice it until you ran your hand across and felt the weight of everything that had been left behind. Ethan Cole did not mark the days anymore. Not the way he used to when each sunrise felt like something to measure against a promise he still believed he could keep, but time marked him all the same. In the lines at the corners of his eyes, in the stiffness of his hands when the mornings turned cold, in the way his horse no longer needed a command to slow near the house. The land remained the same in the ways that mattered, wide and patient, stretching mile after mile without asking who owned it or who deserved it. But something in Ethan had shifted, not broken, not lost, just worn into a quieter shape that fit the years he had lived through. People still passed through now and then, traders, drifters, men chasing rumors of land or silver or something they could not quite name, and they all carried stories the way travelers do, loosely, without much care for what stayed behind when they moved on. Ethan did not ask for those stories, but he heard them anyway, in fragments, in half-finished sentences spoken over tin cups and fading light. There was talk, sometimes, of a woman further west, a leader among her people, young but steady, the kind who did not raise her voice yet did not need to, the kind who could stand in a circle of men twice her age and leave them quiet without saying much at all. They said she wore something at her neck, a small piece that did not belong to her people, something simple, worn, carried not for show but for memory. Ethan never asked her name. He did not need to. The first time he heard it, something in him had already answered. Iona. The name did not come with certainty, not at first, just a quiet recognition that settled in his chest the same way that promise had all those years ago, without asking permission. He did not ride west. He did not saddle up and follow the direction those stories pointed, because he understood something now that he had not understood then. Some distances are not meant to be crossed by footsteps. Some are meant to remain, so that what travels between them can carry more than a man ever could. Instead, he stayed, and the ranch grew older with him, the wood darkening, the fence lines shifting, the fields giving what they could and taking back what they must. The leather cord he had found remained near the door, hanging from a nail where he could see it each morning without needing to reach for it. And sometimes, when the light hit it just right, he would pause for a second longer than usual, not to remember, but to acknowledge something that had not left, even after all this time. Then came the winter that stayed longer than it should have. The air turned sharp before the year had settled, and the cold moved in with a quiet persistence that did not break, day after day, night after night, pressing into the walls, into the ground, into the spaces between breath and thought. Ethan felt it more than he had in years past, not as pain, not exactly, but as a kind of slowing, as if his body had begun to listen to something the rest of the world ignored. He worked less, not by choice, but because the work no longer waited for him the way it once had, and the mornings came with a weight that asked for stillness instead of motion. It was during one of those mornings, before the sun had fully risen, that he heard it again, not the wind, not the creak of old wood, but something else, something steady and distant, moving across the land with a rhythm that did not belong to one horse or two, but many. He did not rush to the door. He did not reach for his hat or his coat. He simply sat there for a moment, listening, the sound growing clearer with each passing second, until it filled the space around him without ever breaking the quiet. By the time he stood, The light had begun to stretch across the ground outside, thin and pale, and the air held that stillness that comes just before something changes. He stepped onto the porch slowly, the wood beneath his boots familiar in a way that needed no thought, and he looked out across the land that had carried him through more years than he had ever planned to count. At first, there was nothing, just the open stretch of dirt and grass and the low line of the horizon. But then, like something rising out of the land itself, shapes began to form. One, then another, then many, until the space in front of his ranch was no longer empty, but filled with a presence that did not need to move to be felt. He did not count them. He did not need to. The number did not matter. What mattered was the way they held themselves, the stillness, the quiet, the absence of anything that could be mistaken for threat or demand. And at the center, just beyond the reach of the morning light, a single figure stepped forward, not in haste, not in hesitation, but with the kind of certainty that does not ask to be understood. Ethan stood there, his hand resting lightly against the doorframe, his breath slow, steady, and for the first time in many years, the promise did not feel like something waiting. It felt like something that had arrived. She stopped 10 steps short of the porch, not because she needed the distance, but because the space between them carried weight, years of it, and neither of them rushed to close it. The warriors behind her remained still, their presence wide and quiet like the land itself, not pressing forward, not pulling back, simply there, as if they had always been part of this place and were only now choosing to be seen. Ethan did not step down from the porch, not yet, his hand resting lightly against the frame as if it anchored him to something that had not shifted, even as everything else had. The morning air held steady, cool enough to remind him of the season, still enough to carry every small sound, the soft breath of horses, the faint creak of leather, the quiet movement of fabric against wind that had not yet begun to move. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he once knew but never fully understood, not searching for what had changed, but recognizing that change had already done its work. Ayanna. He did not say her name out loud, but it settled in him all the same, clearer now than it had ever been when it first reached his ears years ago, carried by strangers who did not know what they were speaking into. She was no longer the girl he had pulled from the river. That much was plain without needing to be measured, but there was something in the way she held herself, in the stillness behind her eyes, that carried a thread from that moment into this one, unbroken, unhidden. Around her neck, the pendant rested against her chest, the same small piece of metal that had once caught the light in his hand, now worn in a way that spoke of time, not neglect, its edges softened, its surface marked by years that had not erased it, only made it part of something larger. Ethan's gaze lingered there for a second longer than he intended, then lifted back to her face, where no accusation waited, no question either, just a kind of calm that did not ask to be explained. "You came," she said, her voice steady, carrying across the distance without effort, and for a moment, the words felt simple, almost too simple for everything they held. Ethan let out a breath that had been waiting longer than he realized, his shoulders easing just slightly as he stepped down from the porch, one slow step, then another, until he stood on the same ground as her, the space between them smaller now, but no less significant. "I did not think I would," he answered, and the honesty of it settled between them without resistance, because out here, truth did not need to be dressed up to be accepted. She studied him then, not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with the kind of attention that notices what has been carried and what has been left behind, her eyes moving over the lines time had drawn across his face, the way he stood without leaning, the way his hands remained open, empty, as they had been the first time she saw him. There was no rush in her, no urgency to speak again, and in that pause, the land seemed to lean in, as if it had been waiting for this moment longer than either of them had. Behind her, one of the horses shifted slightly, a soft step that broke nothing, only marked time, and somewhere farther out, a bird called once, then fell silent again. Ethan felt the years between them in that silence, not as distance, but as something that had been built, layer by layer, choice by choice, until it stood now as a bridge neither of them had planned, but both had crossed in their own way. He glanced once toward the line of warriors, not counting, not measuring, just acknowledging, and what he saw there was not threat, Not even protection in the way men usually understood it, but something quieter, something that stood without needing to prove itself. "They are not here for you," he said, his voice low, more observation than question, and Ayanna followed his gaze for a brief moment before returning it to him. "They are here because of you," she replied, and the distinction settled into the air with a weight that did not press down, only deepened what was already there. Ethan frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in the way a man does when he realizes there is more to his story than the part he has lived, and he did not ask her to explain, not yet, because something told him that whatever had brought her here had taken its time, and it would not be rushed now. Instead, he nodded once, slow, accepting what he did not yet understand, and in that small movement, there was no resistance, only a quiet readiness to hear what had already begun long before this morning. Ayanna took one step closer, the distance between them narrowing to something that no longer felt like a boundary, and as she did, her hand rose, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to touch the pendant at her neck, her fingers resting there for a moment, as if confirming something that had never truly been in question. "You said you would come back," she said, her voice softer now, but no less steady, and Ethan met her gaze without looking away, the words returning to him not as memory, but as something still present, still alive in the space between one breath and the next. "I tried," he said, and this time, there was no explanation behind it, no story offered to fill the gap, just the truth as it stood, simple and complete. Ayanna watched him for a long moment, the silence stretching again, but different now, not empty, not waiting, but full of something that had finally reached its place, and when she spoke again, there was no accusation in it, no question of whether he had kept or broken what he had promised. "I know," she said, and in those two words, something shifted, not in the land, not in the air, but in the space between them, where a promise that had once belonged to one moment now stood, changed, carried, and returned in a way neither of them could have shaped on their own. The wind returned, but softer now, moving through the open land like it understood it had arrived late to something that had already been decided. Ethan stood still, not because he was unsure, but because there was nothing left in him that needed to rush, and across from him, Ayanna did not move either, her presence steady in a way that made the years between them feel less like distance and more like something that had been shaped, refined, carried forward with purpose neither of them had fully seen until now. The pendant rested against her chest, catching a thin line of morning light, and for a moment, that small piece of metal seemed heavier than anything else in the world, not because of what it was, but because of what it had carried across time without breaking. Ethan's gaze lingered there again, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, and when he looked back up, something in his expression had softened, not in weakness, but in understanding. "You kept it," he said quietly, and Ayanna's hand brushed the pendant once more, not as a gesture, but as something instinctive, something that had become part of her without needing to be thought about. "It was never mine to lose," she replied, and the words settled between them with a clarity that did not need explanation. Behind her, the line of warriors remained unchanged, silent, patient, their presence stretching across the land like a boundary no one had drawn, but everyone could feel. Ethan glanced toward them again, then back to her, the question forming before he spoke it, not out of doubt, but out of the need to understand what had grown beyond him. "Why are they here?" he asked, and this time, there was no hesitation in his voice, only a quiet readiness to hear what he had not been there to witness. Ayanna did not answer right away. Instead, she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the line of riders, not to count them, not to measure them, but to acknowledge them, and in that small motion, something shifted in the air, not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to be felt by anyone paying attention. When she looked back at Ethan, her eyes held something deeper now, something that carried more than memory. "When you left," she said, her voice even, each word placed carefully as if it had traveled a long way to reach this moment, "I believed you would not return." Ethan nodded once, accepting it without defense, because it was the truth as it had appeared, and truth, out here, did not change just because a man wished it had been different. "So I returned instead," she continued, and the simplicity of it carried a weight that no long explanation could have matched. He felt that then, not as a shock, but as something settling into place, a missing piece finding where it had always belonged without him noticing the absence before. "I saw what was coming for you," she said, her gaze steady, not accusing, not protective, just stating what had already happened, "and I knew you would not ask for help." Ethan let out a small breath, something close to a quiet acknowledgement of a part of himself he had never tried to hide, and would not begin to now. "So you brought them," he said, and Ayanna shook her head slightly, the movement subtle but deliberate. "No," she answered, "they came because I did." The distinction hung there, quiet but undeniable, and for a moment, Ethan did not respond, because he understood now that what stood behind her was not something she had gathered, not something she had commanded into existence, but something that had chosen to stand with her, the same way the land chose where to hold water and where to let it run free. He looked past her again, really looked this time, not at the number, not at the formation, but at the stillness, the absence of threat, the quiet certainty that did not need to prove itself. And in that moment, something shifted inside him, not a realization, not a revelation, but a recognition of something he had been part of without ever seeing the full shape of it. Ayanna stepped closer again, closing the last of the distance between them, and when she spoke next, her voice was lower, not weaker, just closer to something that did not belong to anyone else listening. "You said you would come back for me," she said, and Ethan held her gaze, not looking away, not searching for words that might change what had already been spoken years ago. "I know," he said, and there was no apology in it, no defense, just the truth as it stood. Ayanna studied him for a long moment, her eyes moving slightly as if reading something written in a language only time could translate. And then, slowly, she reached up and lifted the pendant from where it rested, holding it between them, the small piece catching the light once more, brighter now, as if it had been waiting for this moment to be seen clearly. "This was never about you coming back," she said, her voice steady, and Ethan felt that before he understood it, the words landing somewhere deeper than thought. "It was about whether you meant it." The silence that followed did not stretch, it settled, full and complete, and Ethan did not speak into it, because there was nothing he could add that would carry more weight than what had already been placed between them. Ayanna lowered the pendant slowly, letting it fall back against her chest, and when she looked at him again, there was no question left in her eyes, no uncertainty, only something that had found its answer long before this morning had begun. "And that is why they are here," she said, her voice returning to its steady calm, and for the first time since the riders had appeared on the horizon, the meaning of their presence no longer stood at a distance. It stood with him, quiet, undeniable, and already complete. The words did not echo, they settled, the kind that do not need to be repeated to be understood, and Ethan felt them the way a man feels the shift in weather before the wind ever changes, quiet, certain, already done. He did not look at the warriors this time, not because they were no longer there, but because they no longer needed to be explained. What stood before him was no longer a question of numbers or presence. It was something else entirely, something that had grown from a single moment into something that could not be measured in the usual ways men count things. Ayanna watched him without pressing for a response, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as if she already knew that whatever answer existed did not belong to words. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that carries more than air, and his gaze drifted past her for just a second, not to avoid her, but to take in the land behind her, the riders, the stillness, the quiet order that had formed without force. Then he looked back at her, and there was something different in his eyes now, not surprise, not confusion, just a kind of acceptance that had taken years to find its way to the surface. "I did not come back," he said, not as a question, not as a defense, just as a fact placed plainly between them, and Ayanna did not nod, did not correct him, because they both knew what the words meant and what they did not. "No," she said, and the simplicity of it carried no judgment, only clarity. "But you did not leave either." The distinction landed softly, but it did not pass through him lightly. Ethan held her gaze, the meaning of it unfolding in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and for the first time since she had arrived, something in his chest shifted in a way that felt less like weight and more like release. He had stayed, through seasons that changed and years that settled, through silence that could have erased what he once said but did not, through days that carried no sign of her and nights that offered no answer. He had stayed. Ayana stepped closer still, until there was no distance left that needed to be crossed, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the moment did not ask for it. The wind moved again, gently this time, brushing past them, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant water, and somewhere behind the line of riders, a horse shifted its stance, a small sound that reminded the world it was still turning. Then Ayana reached up once more, her fingers resting against the pendant, and she held it there for a second before letting it fall back into place. "I thought you forgot," she said, her voice softer now, not weaker, just closer to something that did not belong to anyone else. "For a long time, I believed that." Ethan did not interrupt. He did not explain. He did not offer the reasons that had kept him from returning when he said he would, because he understood now that those reasons had never been the point. Instead, he listened. The way a man listens when he knows what is being said matters more than what he might add. "But the land remembers," she continued, her gaze drifting briefly toward the horizon, then back to him. "And people do too, even when they do not realize it." She paused, not for effect, but because the words that followed did not need to be rushed. "I heard about a man who kept going back to a river long after there was nothing left to find," she said, and there was the faintest hint of something in her expression then. Not quite a smile, not quite anything that could be named, just a small shift that made the moment feel more human, more real. A man who left food where no one asked for it, who looked for signs that were never meant to be seen, who stayed when it would have been easier to forget. Ethan lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not in shame, not in regret, but in acknowledgement of a version of himself he had not considered worth telling. When he looked back up, there was no defense in him, no need to claim what he had done or why. "I did not know you would hear any of that," he said, and Ayana shook her head slightly. "I did not," she replied, "not at first. But someone did." She turned her head just enough to glance toward the line of riders, and in that small motion, something became clear without needing to be spoken aloud. "Stories travel," she said, "not like men do, not in straight lines, but they find their way all the same." Ethan followed her gaze this time, not searching, not questioning, just seeing, and in the stillness of those riders, in the quiet respect that held them there without command, he understood what had grown beyond him, what had been carried forward in ways he could not have planned or controlled. Ayana turned back to him, her eyes steady once more, and when she spoke again, her voice carried that same calm certainty that had been there from the moment she stepped off her horse. "You did not come back when you said you would," she said, and again, there was no accusation in it, only truth. "But you never stopped coming back." The words settled into him deeper than anything that had been said before, not because they changed what had happened, but because they revealed what had been there all along, unseen, unspoken, but no less real. Ethan did not respond right away. He stood there, the weight of years and choices and quiet moments gathering into something that no longer needed to be sorted or understood piece by piece. It simply was. And in that stillness, with the land stretching out around them and the riders holding their place without moving, something else became clear, something that did not belong to either of them alone. This was not a return the way he had imagined it all those years ago, not a man keeping a promise in the way men usually measure such things. This was something quieter, something that had taken its time, that had moved through years and silence and distance to arrive here, whole and unchanged in the only way that mattered. Ayana stepped back then, not far, just enough to shift the space between them once more, and when she did, the line of riders behind her seemed to breathe with her movement, not advancing, not retreating, simply acknowledging the moment as it passed from one shape into another. Ethan watched her, not with uncertainty, not with expectation, just with the kind of attention that comes when a man knows he is standing at the end of something and the beginning of something else. And for the first time since that day by the river, he did not feel the need to say anything at all. The moment did not end. It softened, like light at the edge of day when the sun has not yet set, but the world has already begun to let go. Ayana stepped back one more time, just enough for the space between them to breathe again, and in that small distance, something final settled without needing to be named. She did not turn away immediately. Instead, she looked at Ethan the way one looks at something that has completed its purpose, not discarded, not forgotten, but understood in a way that no longer asks for anything more. Around them, the land remained still, wide and patient, holding the silence as if it had been waiting years for this exact quiet to arrive. Ethan stood where he was, his hands at his sides, his posture unchanged, but inside him, something had shifted in a way that no one else could see, not a release, not relief, but a kind of stillness that had not been there before, the kind that comes when a man no longer carries what he once thought he owed the world. Ayanna lowered her hand from the pendant, letting it rest once more against her chest, and for a brief moment, her gaze drifted past him, toward the small ranch house, the worn fence, the stretch of land that had held him all these years without asking who he had been before or who he had promised to become. Then she spoke, not loudly, not with command, but with the kind of voice that does not need to rise to be followed. "We stay," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried across the open space with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Ethan did not turn, but he felt it behind him, the shift that followed, subtle, quiet, but absolute. The way the riders adjusted not in formation, not in movement toward or away, but in presence, settling into the land as if they had chosen it, as if this place now held something worth standing for. He closed his eyes for a second, just long enough to feel that truth settle fully, then opened them again, the world before him unchanged and entirely different at the same time. "You do not have to do this," he said, his voice low, not as refusal, not as protest, just as something that needed to be acknowledged, and Ayanna shook her head once, the motion small but certain. "This is not for you," she replied, and the words did not diminish what stood behind her, they clarified it. "This is because of you." The difference rested between them like a line drawn in dust, clear to anyone who cared to see it. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting it in the same quiet way he had accepted everything else that had led him here, without trying to reshape it into something easier to carry. The wind moved again, stronger this time, carrying with it the sound of leather shifting, hooves pressing lightly against dry ground, the small, natural sounds of life continuing without interruption, and yet nothing felt the same. Ayanna turned then, not abruptly, not as someone leaving, but as someone who had arrived, and now understood what came next, her steps steady as she moved back toward her horse. She did not look back immediately, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might not, but just before she reached the saddle, she paused, her hand resting lightly against the worn leather, and she turned her head just enough to meet his eyes one last time. There was no smile there, no sadness, no unfinished question, only something complete, something that did not need to be spoken again. Ethan held that gaze, not reaching for it, not holding on to it, just allowing it to exist for as long as it chose to remain. Then she mounted, smooth and certain, and with a small shift of her posture, the line of riders responded, not with noise, not with force, but with movement that felt like the land itself had decided to change shape. They did not rush. They did not scatter. They spread, slowly, deliberately, forming a wide arc around the ranch, not closing in, not surrounding, but standing, a quiet boundary drawn not in threat, but in presence. Ethan watched them, his expression unchanged, but his eyes following the way they moved, the way they settled into positions that did not block the world out, but held it at a respectful distance. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time did not seem to move in the usual way anymore, and the sun climbed higher, casting longer light across the ground, catching on the edges of things that had always been there, but had never felt this clear. Ethan remained on the porch for a long while, then stepped down once more, his boots pressing into the same dirt that had carried him through years of waiting without promise of return, and he walked a few steps forward, stopping at the edge of where the open land began to stretch beyond what he could call his own. He did not cross that line. He did not need to. Behind him, the ranch stood as it always had, worn but steady, and beyond it, the riders held their place, not as guards in the way men usually understand protection, but as something quieter, something that did not need to explain itself to be known. The day moved on, as all days do, the light shifting, the shadows lengthening, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called once, then again, as if testing whether the world would answer differently now. It did not in sound, not in movement, but in something deeper, something that had settled into the ground itself, something that would remain long after the moment had passed. And in the years that followed, people would speak of this place in ways they did not fully understand, of a ranch that no one troubled, of riders who appeared without warning and stayed without reason, of a man who lived quietly at the center of something no one could quite explain. They would call it many things: protection, loyalty, even legend, but none of those words would hold the full weight of what had happened here. Because out on that stretch of land, where the wind carried stories farther than men could ride, a promise had not been kept in the way it was spoken, but it had not been broken either. It had simply waited, changed shape, and found its way back in silence, until the day it no longer belonged to one man at all, but to the land, to the people, and to the quiet understanding that some things, once given honestly, do not end. They remain, long enough to become something no one needs to explain, because everyone who stands close enough can feel it without being told.